The Countess of the Blue Roses. Raven entered the room and shut the door firmly behind him. The preparations are complete, my lord, he said in a low voice. Lydia was in the room next door and she had just begun to doze. Though it was unlikely that she would overhear them, Edgar's servant seemed to sense that he didn't want to take the risk. Raven had come a long way, showing her such consideration now. Slowly but surely, he was acquiring human emotions and growing used to a life of quiet. Edgar certainly had his scruples about asking him to assist in something so brutal. But be that as it may, the Earl was still engaged in a fight for his life, and Raven was his soldier. He knew that his servant would follow him to the ends of the earth. It was his belief that the orders he gave as a master formed the firm bond between them, and that was why he pressed on. Does Annie seem afraid? Not particularly. She continues to be stubborn in the pretense that she cannot speak. Apply a little threat. Lydia would detest what Edgar was doing. However, he had no other methods available to him. He had chosen the most effective way to protect those close to him and retreat from his enemies, as he had always done and would likely continue to do. He intended to be thorough, even if he was dealing with nothing more than a gang of thieves. Please take a look at this, my lord, Raven continued, holding up a bunch of red hair. Annie's presumably. You scalped her. It is a wig, my lord. It was still a little early to expect Raven to understand jokes. And Annie's real hair is dark. With that, everything fell into place at last. Annie had been the one to sneak into Lady Orchard's room. All Lucinda had done was hide the jewelry box so that she could try to pin more blame on Lydia. Well discovered, Raven. We know now what we need to do. The boy stayed quiet, apparently waiting for him to elaborate. Instead, Edgar muttered something quite unrelated. You know, Raven, I think Lydia has fallen for me more than I realized. His servant merely looked at him, clearly unsure how to respond. Edgar had partly been talking to himself, but he felt now that some sort of excuse was in order for what was about to happen. She has put in an awful lot of effort for my sake. No matter how she suffered, she didn't yield, endeavoring to become the fiancé she felt I wanted. Naturally, Edgar recognized that Lydia was also concerned about the vanished countess in her capacity as a fairy doctor, but her insistence on continuing as a maid was likely for his sake. He didn't think it was conceitedness that had him believing he was becoming more important to her. There was an innocence to her utterance that she was not fit to be his fiancée, and he now realized that he might have been hurrying her too much. It would likely take a long time for her to understand how passionately he felt, but Edgar was more than happy to wallow in his impatience. Their rising romance is nothing short of nonsense. He who loves most loses most. I am sure that the opposite holds true when it comes to Lydia. Edgar would do whatever it took to protect her. That sentiment ought to be enough to keep his selfish desires, a result of his curse, at bay. He wanted to believe that having people to fight for, his lover, his family, his companions, would save him from any impending corruption. He got to his feet. Shall we begin? As Edgar approached Lucinda's room, he heard her shrill voice spilling out into the corridor. Explain yourself, father. Where is Annie? Won't you tell the butler to go and look for her? I am sure that she will return eventually. She went to replace the water in my vase and has yet to return. Yes, she has a habit of slacking sometimes, but it's almost noon. I cannot abide this. To think she had clung to Edgar crying, so anxious about her missing maid. In reality, it sounded as if she wouldn't shed a tear even if Annie never came back. I have treated her only with kindness despite her muteness, and yet I am sure she secretly regards me as a fool. Edgar stopped in front of the door. It opened without him having to knock. Lucinda, prepared to rush out, halted just before she walked into him. Lord Ashenbert, what can I do for you? She looked away, clearly not having forgotten how he drove her out earlier. Her glances, however, spoke of expectation. I beg you forgive my earlier impertinence, Lady Lucinda. She frowned, a poor attempt at suppressing a smile. Indeed, never have I been subject to such impertinence. To think that an earl would see fit to come to a maid's defense. She was unbelievably pompous. Edgar had to suppress his own smile as he continued meekly. I have found your maid by way of apology. It proved to be quite the endeavour. Your lordship found Annie? Where was she and what was she doing? You mentioned you had tasked her with taking your jewelry box somewhere, yes? However, she didn't have it with her. I am currently investigating whether she might have hidden it somewhere. Lucinda, did Annie attempt to abscond with your jewelry? Constable sounded surprised as he approached. Oh, well, the sudden idea of her maid being treated as a thief seemed to have Lucinda panicking. We must interrogate her at once. I'm very sorry for the trouble my daughter has put you through, Ashenbert. Where is Annie? The older Earl was being unusually amenable. He must have truly believed that Edgar had searched for Annie for Lucinda's sake. I would be happy to show you to her. I have someone keeping an eye on her to ensure she doesn't attempt to flee. Edgar led them to a room at the farthest edge of the estate. It didn't seem to be oft visited, so they wouldn't attract attention should they cause a disturbance. He opened the door without knocking. Raven was waiting for them by the lit fireplace. Annie, Lucinda murmured. It was no wonder that the blood drained from Lucinda's face. Her pale, downcast maid was tied to a chair. Raven's light threats had proven effective. Merely inflicting pain on someone did not amount to torture. It was less the physical sensations and more the possibility of upcoming agony that sent people falling into a bottomless pit of terror. That was why instruments of torture tended to be so exaggerated in appearance. It wasn't difficult to devastate someone by describing in graphic detail what would happen if they didn't comply. One didn't even need to lift a finger. Your mistress has come for you, Annie. Perhaps now would be a suitable time to beg for her assistance. The maid looked at Edgar, her eyes fearful, but she didn't so much as spare a glance for Lucinda. The ivory box that contains Lady Lucinda's jewels. Tell us where you have hidden it, and I am sure she will come to your aid. You would do well to speak sooner rather than later, Edgar went on. Lord Ashenbert, Lucinda called, bewildered. Annie cannot talk. She has never been able to utter a word since her birth. Is that so? I wonder. Have you ever tested that theory? Tested it? It was how she was introduced to me. You haven't, then. I must say that seems rather careless of you. Has it never occurred to you that she might be feigning her muteness? If so, I would wager she has all sorts of interesting tales to tell. Nonsense, Lucinda was clearly dismayed. Presumably, she had told Annie all sorts of things that she would rather not be passed on. It is unwise to be too trusting of others. We must therefore test whether she can speak or not for ourselves, Edgar said, approaching the hearth. He pulled out the long, thin poker skewered into the red-hot firewood. Annie started to tremble, no doubt at the image of that scorching metal being pressed against her. Edgar nevertheless continued. Do you know how they used to torture people? They would use these to tear flesh from the cheek, burning it all the while. Apparently, any witnesses would wear earplugs, because the resultant screams could be quite unpleasant. I dare say we won't have to worry about that, seeing as Annie is without voice. The maid writhed against her restraints while Raven kept her in place from behind. Lucinda and Constable stayed silent, as if they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Edgar took hold of her head and, unable to move, Annie let her gaze meet his. Her eyes widened with fright, and he had to wonder what she found there. A demon, perhaps? Edgar had been here several times before. He recognized that this was the decisive moment. No, stop. Help. Annie was screaming before the poker came into contact with her cheek. I don't know where her jewelry is. It's probably all fake anyway. Once she started, she didn't stop, as if clinging to the belief that she would be saved by her own words. I'm sure she just hid the box somewhere herself, just like how she lied about the brooch being stolen. Lucinda had spread those nasty rumors about Lydia on purpose. Annie had been ordered to put the brooch in the fairy doctor's room. She went on to tell how Lucinda had involved her in all sorts of schemes, and she did so with glee. Not only that, she revealed that the letters from the man with Edgar's initials, as well as the girl's nighttime meeting with him, were all fabrications. Lucinda had written those tales of the fake man into a diary and purposely left it for her father to find. "Stop this, Annie," the maid's mistress cried. "Why must you spout such outrageous lies? They're no lies. The only reason you wanted a mute maid in the first place was so that no one would find out about your goody two-shoes act. How many times did you tell me you were tired of having to vilify your handmaids and drive them out every time they threatened to snitch on you?" Constable put a firm hand on the shoulder of his chalk-faced daughter. "Is this true, Lucinda? Did you in fact have no correspondence with Ashenbert?" "Father." "Come." Sensing his daughter's embarrassment, Constable made to lead her from the room. "What shall I do with Annie?" Edgar stepped in to ask. "Whatever you like. She is hereby dismissed." It seemed a rather high-handed reaction to him. She has yet to reveal the location of Lady Lucinda's jewelry. "And what of it? It's all worthless, I'm sure." Edgar's eyes widened. It seemed Annie's assertions about the jewelry's authenticity were true. Not that it particularly mattered. He turned back to the maid. "The jewelry is no longer of any concern. The ivory box, however, is a different matter. Lady Orchard's regard necklace is hidden within it. That is why you took it, no?" Annie and Lucinda both reacted with shocked expressions that Edgar pretended not to notice. It seemed Constable was too enraged to hear what he had said. He dragged Lucinda out of the room at once. Nevertheless, Edgar was satisfied that she would spring his trap. There was no doubt in his mind that she would go to retrieve the hidden jewelry box. Annie and her accomplices would be waiting for her to do so. Naturally, the regard necklace was not in the box, but both girls now seemed to believe it was. And with that, Edgar was poised to round up the entire gang of thieves. Lydia woke up in the evening having regained much of her strength. A maid had been assigned to her room. An older one, not one of the ones who had grieved her. She brought porridge as soon as the fairy doctor was up. Mrs. Boyle must have chosen her because she and Lydia had never met. Lydia stirred through the porridge just in case it contained anything it shouldn't, but, finding nothing, she was satisfied and began to eat. Now that her exhaustion had gone and her mind was clear again, she became concerned for Lady Orchard. Tonight was the full moon. She needed to act before dawn, but Edgar had told her to wait until he had expelled the gang of thieves. She was at a dead end in any case, because she had yet to discover the secret of the Dane's treasure. Be that as it may, she could see a small glimmer of hope. If it was the regard necklace that allowed entry to the rose garden, then perhaps the Danes considered it precious. Lydia believed it might have been a present from them to the Orchard estate, a sign of their trust. The Danes despised having humans in their garden. The one Lydia had met had become enraged and accused her of being a thief. It followed that their treasure may well be hidden in the garden. The question was where. Perhaps it was buried, much like traditional treasure. She would only get one opportunity to bargain with the fairies. There was no room for failure. And that was where her thoughts grew stuck. Perhaps negotiating with them and rescuing the Countess was all beyond her. She had been without confidence for a long time, and the desire to give up on everything was growing. But she was a fairy doctor. She wanted to do everything within her power to resolve the matter. She still had yet to do that, even if it transpired that she couldn't save Lady Orchard after all. That was when she recalled the Countess's blue roses. They were supposed to bloom when the moon rose tonight. Now that she thought of it, the estate had received a visitor that day. It must have been Lady Orchard's friend, the one with whom she had exchanged the promise about the roses. The friend must have read the letter and come today to see them, and the Countess had asked Lydia to pass on the message that the roses had indeed bloomed. But, the fairy doctor realized, it might not have been too late for the visitor to see them for herself. Lydia got out of bed and put on her own dress. Should her first introduction to this noblewoman be in her maid's uniform, she doubted anything she had to say about fairies would be listened to. She might not be taken seriously even in her usual attire, but she was determined to try. Her Grace, the Duchess Brightberry, will not be disturbed. There was a private flight of stairs leading to the noblewoman's guest room. When Lydia attempted to climb it, however, she was warned by a woman coming the other way. Though she tried to explain herself, the woman would not have it. Should Lady Ortred not return by tomorrow morning, Her Grace will be taking her leave. As discourteous as I realize it is, I must insist that no one sees her. Rather than the Duchess's lady's maid, Lydia had the impression this woman was a family member or acquaintance who had travelled with her. She was dressed modestly, but her speech and carriage suggested nobility through and through. I must speak to Her Grace regarding Lady Ortred. I have a message from her ladyship. The woman scrutinized Lydia. The fairy doctor wished she had tied up her hair and perhaps put some gloves on. The woman had probably recognized at first glance that she was a commoner, and what would a commoner be doing with a message from a missing countess? My name is Lydia Carlton. I am imposing on her ladyship in order that she might teach me proper etiquette. I shall hear the message. It didn't sound as if Lydia would be able to speak to the Duchess directly, but she would rather recount the Countess's sentiment here than let it go unexpressed. Lady Ortred has succeeded in cultivating the promised roses. However, certain circumstances mean she is unable to return to the estate, and so she tasked me with telling Her Grace that the blue roses have bloomed. Have you seen the roses for yourself? Yes. Well, not quite. They were still budding. But they will bloom tonight, and only tonight. Lydia hesitated for a moment before steeling her resolve. Lady Ortred is in a fairy rose garden. That is where the blue roses are. I am not sure whether Her Grace will believe me, but if you would be so kind as to pass it on. Though she had prepared herself for the frown of someone regarding a lunatic, the woman made no such expression. Am I to take it that you have been to this garden yourself? She asked quietly. I have. I am a fairy doctor. However, I lack experience, and do not believe I will manage to rescue Lady Ortred from the garden. The fairies intend to close it off at daybreak, and I fear there is nothing I can do. Her ladyship has resigned herself to sharing its fate. She seemed so dejected to miss the opportunity to show Her Grace the roses. It was all she could do to leave me with a message. Lydia spoke as quickly as she could, hoping to express everything before the woman became disinclined to believe her. The rose garden ought still to be accessible before dawn. I would be able to lead Her Grace there. However, it exists within the fairy world. There is no knowing what will await us there, and there is a possibility of danger. So while I cannot recommend such a course of action, I am willing to do anything that is required of me. The woman waited patiently for Lydia to finish. Her response was perfectly composed. Very well. Please show me to the garden. I beg your pardon. I am Brightberry. Edgar didn't get his opportunity to learn about Annie's accomplices and thieving schemes from her. Constable returned and escorted her away too soon. Despite his earlier dismissive attitude, he seemed to have changed his mind, perhaps wanting to rid Annie of the chance to disparage his daughter further. He had given Edgar a tongue-lashing when he did so, looking at him as if he were the root of all evil for exposing the maid's falsehoods. Ashenbert, I'm afraid I was woefully unimpressed to see you all but torture a delicate young lady, maid though she may be. Bearing witness to it all has left Lucinda terribly frightened too. All this talk of tearing away flesh with a burning poker. It is abhorrent, even if you never intended to go through with it. Oh, but I had every intention of doing so. She merely spoke before I had need to. Constable peered at Edgar's eyes as if trying to ascertain whether the younger man was joking or not. He only let their gazes lock for a moment before looking away again, muttering something about insanity before roughly grabbing Annie's arm. How is Lady Lucinda faring? Edgar asked. I shall have her keep to her room for the time being. While I apologize for the inconvenience she has caused you, I shall thank you to stay away from her in future. Constable seemed to be implying that an insane man was not a suitable fit for his daughter. Edgar was happy for him to think so if it would spare Lydia from Lucinda's jealousy. He nodded with a smile. Constable fled from the room with Annie in tow. It didn't matter to Edgar precisely what her accomplices were planning. He would have them act as he wanted them to. And so he had set the trap with Lucinda as the decoy. He had intended to release Annie without much of a fuss so she could make contact with her companions, but Constable had saved him the trouble by leading her away anyway. The older Earl likely meant to force her to keep quiet about the scandal with Lucinda before dismissing her and driving her from his estate. But that was probably what Annie was hoping for. Once she was free, she would inevitably leak the lie to her accomplices that Lucinda had hidden Lady Orchard's regard necklace. Edgar would need to make his preparations hastily if he hoped to capture the gang of thieves. He decided to visit the Duchess Brightberry at once. He had met the woman before. The fact that she was using a pseudonym told him that she wasn't here to see any other nobles, but this was an emergency. He must see her. To his surprise, he was allowed into her room simply by stating his name. He was equally surprised to see her attendants rushing to and fro, an unusual sight for the woman he knew, but he waited obediently nonetheless. Eventually, it was not the Duchess herself, but one of her ladies-in-waiting who appeared from the room's far end. "It is a pleasure to see you again, Lord Ashenbert." He had met this older noblewoman several times as well. He gave a courteous response, after which she spoke in a hurried manner. "My lord, I intend to place my confidence in you and ask for your assistance. Can you give me your word that you will not disclose what I am about to tell you to anyone else?" "Most assuredly so. Is something the matter?" "She has gone missing." "Do you mean Her Majesty?" Though Edgar hadn't exclaimed particularly loudly, the lady-in-waiting lowered her voice further still. "I mean Her Grace, who is traveling incognito." "I understand. Do you mean to say that she took leave of her room without notifying anybody?" "It would appear so. Furthermore, the guard that was supposed to arrive before us also vanished shortly after our arrival, and I found that rather curious. We were aware of Lady Orchard's disappearance, but Her Grace insisted on coming in order to fulfill a promise. We did advise that she not leave the room, given how dangerous things are, but before we realized it, she had vanished. If one of the guards in question was named Billy, then I happen to know where they are." The lady-in-waiting's eyes widened in part surprise and part expectation. "Your lordship knows Lieutenant William Ramsay?" That must have been his full name. He was a serviceman appointed to Her Majesty the Queen. No wonder Edgar had suspected that the man was no mere footman. He and his companions must have been there for some time preparing for the Queen to arrive incognito. "Yes, I do. And I'm afraid I must apologize. I mistook the good lieutenant and his 3 subordinates as thieves targeting Lady Orchard's jewels, apprehended them, and subsequently confined them. I found it suspicious that they were so private with their identities, but I did realize on Her Grace's arrival that I might have been mistaken." "Your lordship captured them? By yourself?" "In truth, the deed was not done by me, but my servant." Goodness. He must have the build of a strong man. Perhaps she felt rather conflicted upon learning that a whole group of military personnel had been dealt with by the single servant of a nobleman. Edgar decided to let the subject of Raven slide past and instead give a summary of the particulars. After Lady Orchard's room was ransacked, Billy and his men had set about trying to rid the estate of the gang of thieves. Unfortunately, since they had mistaken Edgar and Lydia as the guilty party, they had ended up in the manure pit. "I wasn't aware there were thieves about. Only that Lady Orchard has been missing for some time. I suppose the lieutenant and his men must have grown desperate when they learned that Her Grace would not be cancelling her visit." Although the woman seemed sympathetic to Billy and his companions, she did not say anything that would place the blame on Edgar. "Indeed, and so I had a humble request to make of Her Grace. I would like to borrow the assistance of Billy rather, Lieutenant Ramsay. I understand that he might be reluctant to help me of all people, but I have reason to believe that the thieves will take action tonight. I do not have enough hands to subdue them as things stand." "Very well. I shall have the Colonel speak to them. It does, however, make me all the more frightened for Her Grace's safety. I can promise you that we shall conduct our search with great haste. Might I ask that you prepare a bath for Lieutenant Ramsay and his men forthwith?" "Ah, yes. It wouldn't do for Her Grace to retreat from them." The ladies' maids around them giggled. It must have brought them some measure of relief to know that the guard was safe. Lady Ortred and the Queen had been close friends since before the latter ascended the throne. However, following a change of government, the Countess was made to keep her distance from the Queen, as her family held close ties to the previous regime. Regardless, it was unlikely that anyone who knew them doubted the bond between them. Although Lady Ortred had withdrawn from society when she was widowed, it was common knowledge among those in the know that her introduction held great weight with the royal family, at least when it came to women who were estranged from the political sphere. That was why Edgar had hoped to rely on her to help prepare a place for Lydia within Britain's aristocracy. Edgar didn't know of the promise held between them, nor that they would meet on this very day after so many years apart. He had known only that Her Majesty would come to the Ortred estate and that she would be incognito. He'd been planning to introduce Lydia to the Queen here and have her virtues be recognized. It didn't matter to him anymore. He didn't want to put Lydia through any more unpleasantness. Quite apart from anything else, he needed to get her to safety as soon as he could. Unfortunately, she wasn't in her chamber. She was supposed to have been resting, but it seemed she'd wandered off somewhere. While he recognized this was likely no emergency, Edgar couldn't help but worry that she might collapse again, and he hurried off in search of her. He stopped when he came upon Nico. The fairy cat was dozing leisurely on a windowside sofa. It exasperated Edgar that he did absolutely nothing but eat or sleep, leaving Lydia to get herself in trouble. Edgar prodded Nico's nose. When the drowsy fairy cat licked his fingertip like it was a tasty treat, he grew incensed and pinched hard instead. Nico's face twisted in anguish, his eyes snapped open, and he swiped Edgar's hand aside in a flurry. "Cripes, what are you doing, Earl? That hurts. Try to murder me, will you?" Edgar briefly wondered whether fairies could suffocate. Where has Lydia gone? Don't you realize it's dangerous for her to be wandering about by herself? What? She isn't by herself. She told me she was going to the Danes' rose garden with this noblewoman she'd found. I was going to go after her later. I'll thank you to let me sleep a little longer. Nico made to bury his face in the cushion again, only for Edgar to grab him and lift him clear from the sofa. A noblewoman? Not one with dark hair, surely? Dark hair, yes. That was her. And the Danes' garden is where Lady Ortred is, isn't it? Yes. Would you let me down? The noblewoman is most likely Virginia's friend. Lydia was insistent she reunite them, if only briefly. It seemed that Her Majesty was presently with Lydia. Edgar considered whether he ought to have Nico lead him to the rose garden. But then, there was no telling when the gang of thieves might make their move. While the Queen might be safe from the burglars in the rose garden, he also recalled Lydia mentioning that the fairies would close off the garden at dawn, a time limit that was fast approaching. Lord Ashenbert, Raven had joined them. "Might I ask that you unhand Mr. Nico?" The boy seemed concerned to see the fairy cat writhing disgruntledly in Edgar's grip. The Earl acquiesced, marveling at Raven's rare display of sympathy. "I didn't realize you had a fondness for cats, Raven." "Not especially, but for my friend, Mr. Nico." "Ah, I see." Edgar seemed to have overlooked the formation of said friendship. Recognizing he had a powerful ally on his side, Nico stood proudly by Raven's feet, puffing out his chest and smoothing down his coat. "Did you have something to tell me?" the Earl asked his servant. Raven was supposed to be keeping an eye on Lucinda, who was presently being disciplined by her father. "Yes, my lord. Lady Lucinda has slipped out of her room." The wheels were starting to turn. Edgar could no longer let his mind wander about the rose garden. He would purge the thieves from the estate while Lydia was absent. Lieutenant Ramsay ought to be ready about now. Where is he? Present and prepared for duty, thanks to your lordship. Billy was standing in the doorway wearing a fresh change of clothes and a sullen expression. "I have stationed my men to watch over the greenhouse in which you suppose Lady Lucinda has hidden the jewelry box, as requested." "I see. Oh, I shall have to ask that you don't come any closer. The smell is lingering." Though Billy's eyebrows knitted together in anger, he managed to restrain himself. I'll point out that it's the fault of your servant. You would admit that you were bested by a mere servant. He paused. I simply let my guard down. Well, I must ask that you keep it up going forward. Her Majesty's safety is at stake. Billy seemed to pull himself together at that, despite his mood. We'll have to conduct the search for her covertly. I cannot have all of my men focused on driving out the thieves. There is no need for any search. Her Majesty has gone out due to certain circumstances, but she shouldn't be in any peril. I believe Lydia is accompanying her. Lydia? That's Miss Carlton to you, Edgar thought, offended. He recalled how Billy had flirted with her, if only in jest. The Earl went to stand before him, at some distance, and glowered. You will not call my fiancée by her first name. And I shan't apologize for our misunderstanding. Given what you did to her, I had every right to beat you to a bloody pulp. Though Billy opened his mouth to retort, he ultimately kept his silence. The gang is to be lured into the greenhouse and ambushed. You will command your remaining men. The lieutenant gave a reluctant salute before turning on his heel and leaving. Your lordship would stop at words, Raven murmured in surprise after Billy had left. He must have expected Edgar, who invariably had little patience when it came to slights against Lydia, to strike the man. I suspect that much of their uncouth behavior toward her was also an act, given they were playing the part of thieves to keep their identities a secret. His flirtations were not serious, and I am therefore willing to show some leniency. The hedges of the estate's rose garden had yet to bloom with the flowers, and above them a white moon was beginning its ascent into a sky streaked with purple. In the middle of a ring of shrubbery, arranged as if to conceal its middle, was a hole covered in grass accompanied by stone steps. As they proceeded down a ditch-like path with grass-covered walls on either side, Lydia explained to Brightberry that they were nearing the fairies' rose garden. The Duchess showed no signs of nervousness or, indeed, disbelief. She simply nodded at what the fairy doctor told her. You will hear a disembodied voice in just a moment. Please do not respond to it under any circumstances or there will be trouble. Did Virginia answer, perhaps? Indeed she had, but in Lady Orchard's case, the outcome hadn't been so dire. The Danes had recognized her talents. Lady Ortred is a curious lady, isn't she? Lydia said. It is as if her hands are enchanted that she is able to cultivate such beautiful roses. It is no wonder the fairies should be so fond of her. Unfortunately, it is people such as her who get a little too close to them. And these people find themselves in danger. Yes, fairies are much like fire and water. Their existence can be as pleasant to humans as it is disastrous, and they have neither good nor ill will. Just as water can quench one's thirst, so too can it engulf and drown one, yes? It rather sounds as if you are close to the fairies yourself, Miss Carlton. Is that not dangerous? It certainly can be. My lack of experience sometimes means I struggle to hold my own against them. You have a fiancé, if I am not mistaken. I might suggest that you be a bit more careful. The woman chuckled gently as she admired the moonstone ring on Lydia's hand. The fairy doctor was a little surprised to learn that the Duchess could see it. She'd had a fairy cast a spell on the ring to make it invisible to others until she and Edgar were ready to announce their engagement officially. There had been no other choice. The Earl was the only one capable of removing the ring, and he had shown no inclination to do so. Brightberry must have been a woman not easily deceived by fairy magic. As taken aback as she was, Lydia took heart in that. It lowered the chances of trouble befalling them once they were in the fairies' realm. My knowledge of fairies is my sole virtue, and it is my hope that it might be of use to my betrothed, she said. I dare say that most gentlemen wouldn't take such things into consideration when choosing a fiancé. Yes, I suppose beauty and sociability are far more important. Lydia paused. My father is a university professor and I am not of the upper class. That is why I fear I cannot fulfill my fiancé's expectations. Then you must rely on him to do what is beyond you. You are to be married to him, are you not? He ought to be happy to do for you that which you find difficult. Perhaps, but it wasn't as if Edgar could have her audience with the Queen for her. Although Lydia still had her doubts, the Duchess's tone was absolute. She therefore allowed Brightberry's statement to bolster her somewhat. It was as they were speaking that the end of the grassy tunnel came into view. The sun was starting to set, and when they stepped out into the pale purple smolder of the evening, they saw before them the fairies' vast rose garden. Though the voice came to test the intruders, Brightberry did as she was told and did not answer, instead walking forth into the mysterious enclosure. There wasn't so much as a breeze, and clad in the leftover light of the setting sun, the multicolored roses seemed strangely stoic. The moon was yet ghostly in its whiteness, having only just started to rise, its light still too weak to cast upon the earth. Finding Virginia was the most pressing matter. Lydia hurried over to the log cabin, but the gardener wasn't there either. Lady Orchard's notebook sat atop the table, and the Duchess gazed at it pensively. It was packed to the brim with entries about the selective breeding of roses. Perhaps Brightberry found nostalgia within that handwriting. I wonder if she has stepped out, the Duchess said, sparking a realization in Lydia. I know. She must have gone to the hill. The moon was rising. There was no question that Virginia would have gone to see whether the blue roses would bloom. Lydia rushed toward the hill, climbing the stone steps with Brightberry. Sure enough, Lady Orchard was standing in front of the rose bush. Virginia. Lydia called on her approach, and the gardener turned around in surprise. Lydia. Didn't I say you ought not to come here anymore? Why? She trailed off, having caught sight of the woman coming up behind the fairy doctor. Alexandrina? You are looking well, Virginia. I have come to see you, as promised. But, I never expected you would come here. The Duchess approached Lady Orchard with eager footsteps and joyfully took up the other woman's hands in her own. Did we not vow that our friendship would remain forever unchanged? That while our circumstances might prevent us from meeting, it would ultimately be irrelevant. Just as you promised to succeed in cultivating blue roses, so too did I promise to come to meet you when you had, regardless of how inconvenient that might be. Yes, never once did I forget. The roses you desired to see, if only once in your life, will bloom imminently. The women turned to look at the rosebuds before them. The way they held hands like they were young girls again, captivated by the promise of flowers, inspired a spark of jealousy within Lydia. To her, the world of the upper class was something unique. She had considered it a place where one's position in the hierarchy was determined by the social standing of their family, whether from birth or the house they had married into. From there, one was expected to form inoffensive relationships suited to their station. She hadn't realized that precious bonds could form beyond what circumstances might or might not allow. Now that she had witnessed such a thing, she realized there was no reason for her hesitancy. She would join the upper class because Edgar was there. Not everyone would look on her unfavorably for it. Thank you so much for bringing Alexandrina here, Lydia. Virginia extended an inviting hand toward the fairy doctor, who had been watching from a short distance away. Without you, I would never have been able to fulfill my promise. That isn't true, I'm sure, she replied, feeling nothing but guilt. My lady, I was unable to uncover the means to protect this garden. Bringing her grace here was the only thing I could think of to do. Lady Orchard didn't seem all that disappointed. You realized I wasn't a mere gardener, did you? Yes, my lady, when it struck me that your wreath was in fact the regard necklace. There is a portrait of one of your predecessors wearing it. The Countess looked down at the chain of flowers around her neck and nodded. I must apologize for deceiving you. I am unable to give my name when a fairy takes my place. I also feared disappointing you, for I cannot teach you etiquette for as long as I am trapped in this garden. Your ladyship knew I wasn't a maid. I suspected as much from your name after our first meeting. Quite apart from anything else, you are exactly as you were described to me. A sweet, kind-hearted girl more deserving of the title of the Countess of Ibrazel than anybody else. Goodness, Miss Carlton, Brightberry exclaimed. I didn't realize Lord Ashenbert was your fiancé. Yes, He is, Lydia stuttered, embarrassment turning her cheeks red. Say, Alexandrina, doesn't seeing this innocent young lady remind you of when we were preparing for our own weddings? Lady Ortred asked. It certainly does, Virginia. The pair exchanged another light-hearted laugh. The Countess put a gentle hand to her wreath, a memento from her late husband. That was when something struck Lydia as strange. Lady Ortred's regard necklace was supposed to be formed from gemstones crafted into flower motifs. And yet the petals seemed to spring back softly against her fingers, as if made from freshly blooming roses.